Welcome back to Home Cooking Hacks, where we are going to teach you how to do great things in the kitchen without a lot of gizmos and gadgets. So on today's episode, we are going to walk through how to make a very basic bread without annoying things like giant bread makers. So what is the problem with bread makers? Well, I'll tell you the problem with bread makers. First, as you can see here, they take up a lot of space for something that's so niche you can only use it for one thing: making bread. Now, of course, it is easy to just throw the ingredients in, plug it in, and push the thing, and boom, you have bread in 3 hours. That's the advantage. It does consistently make bread without a lot of hassle. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. But suppose you only make bread a couple times a month. Like for me, that's even too much for me. I'm not a huge advocate of bread. Okay, but if I want to make some bread, is it worth having a machine like this laying around for bread once or twice a month? Or is it just more worth my time to say, okay, this afternoon we're going to make bread and we're going to go ahead and do it? And it doesn't take a long time, to be honest with you. We're going to overcome some of the objections. But first, we're going to talk about why else I don't use bread machines. Now, I'm going to get rid of this one as part of my minimizing my kitchen. I've not actually used this, at least not in a dependent case. I tried to record this video before, but my audio or my video encoding wasn't working right, so I'm not going to bother. But we're going to make a single bread today because I'm having some people over for some chili. So, other problems with a bread maker. First is the size and the shape and the dimensions of the bread. You get this giant, big, bulky thing that you can slice out a few pieces of bread out of it, but it generally does not produce it doesn't generally produce a good loaf of bread, as far as I can't make bread here and then slice it up into sandwiches because we have this big thing called a paddle down the middle. So all these bread machines have this big paddle down here. And what it does is it interferes with being able to cut a clean slice of bread down the bottom, especially if it's warm and fresh. So the paddle gets in the way. The size and the shape of the bread is inconsistent with how functional utilitarian bread is. And so this is not something that I can make a loaf of bread in this and then go ahead and use that down the road. And, you know, for me, the biggest thing is the size and the weight of this thing. This thing takes up a lot of space, and we need to get rid of it. So what are some of your objections? Well, one of the big objections is the time it takes to make bread. And I'll be honest with you, it does take a little bit more time. You're going to have to knead the bread for about 10-20 minutes. And that certainly is time commitment. But outside of that, it really doesn't take a lot more time. You need to let it bake for about 45 minutes to an hour. Well, you're not doing anything but throwing it in an oven. You need to let it proof for 45 minutes to an hour. You're not doing anything but throw it in a proofer. The only thing that takes the extra time is you have to hand mix it and knead it. So you do lose about a half hour of time. Not much more than that. Now, the second major objection I hear is how about your proofing? Where do you proof bread? Like, I don't have anywhere to proof bread. Well, you do. You just got to think a little outside the box. I have this thing here called a cooler. Most people have a cooler laying around. If you don't, you can get one pretty cheap. I use coolers for making yogurt. I use coolers for proofing bread. So the thing is, a cooler is not something that just quote-unquote keeps something cool. A cooler is something that keeps stuff isothermic. Okay, so that means that if I take my empty cooler and I pour a bunch of boiling water down here, we end up with a proofer. That's all a proofer is, just something with a lot of hot air in the environment. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to boil up some water and put it in the cooler, and that is actually going to be our proofer. Now, we do want to suspend that on something, and so you need to get creative around your own house, figure out what you can suspend that on. For me, I use coffee mugs. So what we're going to do here is we are going to walk through how to make a very simple bread recipe. You can expand upon this. You can add different flavorings and seasonings. You can do a lot of different things with this. But our basic bread recipe contains flour, salt, sugar, yeast, water, and butter. That's it. And this is a loaf of bread that I will make in a traditional bread pan, which means it'll be a little higher than this, which means I can make this. I can slice it up if I want to do sandwiches. I can, serve this as a nice meal to complement dinner. And basically, it doesn't take up extra gizmos and gadgets. I already have a cooler, and most people do have a cooler laying around. You can buy a cooler, if you don't have one. Of course, you can also use smaller ones. This one here, I don't think my bread pan fits in this one, so I don't actually use this one. But you can get something slightly larger than this and something slightly smaller than my other one. That would work just fine. This is the one I actually use to make yogurt. The other one I use to make bread. Of course, both of them I use if I go camping or something. So that's why I have them. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what we are going to use. For our powder ingredients, and in my powder ingredients, what I want to do is I want to mix them inside of a powder dish. So I want to use, then grab my, I did not grab all of my measuring cups before I started here. So we want to use 2 2/3 cup of flour. And I'm going to use a traditional butter knife here to keep things leveled off. So I'm going to start with 2 2/3 cup of flour. So there's one. It is going to be close in this pan, but I know it's going to fit. I actually used to do a little bit larger bread recipe in this little container here. So there's 2 cups of flour, and now I need 2/3 cup, or 2 2/3 cup total. Okay. And now I need 3/4 teaspoons of salt. And what I have right here is just a 1/4 teaspoon, so I'm just going to use 3 of these. I have a 1/2 teaspoon around somewhere. I could use one of those and one of these, but it takes more time to find that than this. And then we want 1 1/2 tablespoon of sugar. So 1 1/2 tablespoon of sugar. We're going to do not salt, sugar. So here's my 1 tablespoon, and then 1/2 tablespoon is 1 1/2 teaspoon. So there's the sugar. Of course, the sugar feeds the yeast. I know that a lot of people are talking about, too much sugar in bread, and in reality, a lot of your commercial breads do have too much sugar in them because it makes them a little bit sweeter, tastes a little bit better, sells a little bit more. But the reality is, you do need some sugar in there because that's what causes the yeast to grow. So don't get too mad at the fact that you're putting sugar in bread. It's not to make it sweet; it's to feed the yeast. Although we can probably cut that back a little bit more. I've experimented with this recipe a little bit, not as much as I probably need to. Okay, so for the liquid portion, we're going to use butter and we're going to use hot water. I'm actually just going to use hot tap water, as hot as I can get my tap water around here. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to measure out my butter, which is going to be 3 tablespoons. Now, since I'm going to use pretty hot butter or pretty hot water, I frequently would just melt the butter, but in this case here, since I know the water is going to be hot, I pulled the butter out of the refrigerator, and so it's nice and soft. And so I'm not going to need to worry about melting the butter today. So the water will melt it off pretty good. So we want to do 3/4 cup of hot water. And I'm just going to turn on the tap water, make sure that's nice and warm. Just add my hot tap water to that. And then we're going to go ahead and start stirring that around. So you'll see here that it's going to not fully melt, but it's going to melt more than enough for what we need. Now, many of your recipes will call for vegetable oils. In fact, I think that the original recipe where I base this off of calls for vegetable oils. But the reality is vegetable oils are very toxic. You do not want to eat vegetable oils. We get more than enough vegetable oil from the vegetables that we eat. All vegetable oil is highly processed toxic garbage. When you cook it, it makes trans fats, but butter itself is a more of a natural fat, much healthier for you. You just don't need to listen to the people who are out there saying, you know, butter's going to be bad. The reality is, if you actually look at the statistics, which I have, when butter consumption went down, that's when heart disease went up. Okay, so now I added my mixture to that, and our last thing we're going to add is 1.5 teaspoons of yeast. So I actually just bought some packets of dry activated yeast, but each one of those packets is like 2.5 teaspoons, and I only need 1.5 teaspoons to make this. And so what I do is I just put that into a spare small mason jar, and then that's all set. Just kind of keep that in the refrigerator. Okay, so now we're just going to go ahead and mix all this together. I'm going to mix it together with the spoon until it's too thick to do, and then we're just going to dive right on in with our hands and mix it up from there. Okay, so it's kind of getting to that point. So already, we're just going to dive on in here. Now, the thing about bread that will take the longest is the kneading it. So once I get this started and get to the point where I knead it, I'm just going to show you how you knead the bread, and then I'm going to cut the camera off. And you want to knead the bread for about a good 10 to 20 minutes or so, which isn't all that bad, you know, if you think about it. You could always do it sitting down in front of some video or whatever else. For me, I actually like to cook to get away from the computers, the videos, and things like that. So I don't really mind. And I don't think most people would either. I mean, if you're talking about making good homemade food without a lot of gizmos and gadgets, you are going to spend a little bit more time. But really, it gets you more intimate with your food, and that is always a better thing. You know, we need to be more conscious and more intentional about what we're eating. So now you can see I'm going to take the dough, and I'm just literally taking the dough and scraping the edge of the pan. The objective is to get all of the dough mixture mixed into here. And so you can actually see that the pan sort of looks clean now. That is how you can tell everything is going quite well. So now we have our dough pretty much mixed up. I can take it out of the pan. I'm going to leave the pan set aside just because I'm going to want to rest the dough in there for a few minutes after I'm done with this. So basically all I'm doing here is just grabbing it, kneading it, mixing it, digging my thumbs into it, and it'll be about ready when it's very smooth. Okay, so you can see here that it's not all that smooth. We want to get it to the point where when you roll it into a little ball, everything is perfectly smooth. So that's kind of the point that we are mixing this to. So you're just going to continue to do this for about a good 10 or 20 minutes until it's nice and smooth, and then we will come back there and set up the cooler to do the proofing. So my audio was messed up, and so what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and narrate what I'm talking about here for this clip here. All the rest of the clips, the audio is good, so we're going to go ahead here. So right now I'm showing you that after kneading the bread for about 20 minutes, you can now see that it's smooth. If you compare that to a few seconds ago in the video where it still had some roughness to it, now the bread is very smooth, and you can see how pliable it is, that you can easily mix it around, roll it into a ball. It just looks nice and smooth. That's about the time you can stop kneading it. This would usually take me about 10 minutes to get to this point. So we're going to set it in the pan, set that aside, and now we're going to prepare our bread pan. Actually, it looks like we're going to prepare our proofer. All right, so what I do here for the proofer is I have an electric kettle. This is a 1 liter kettle. It's a Hamilton Beach kettle, and if I think of it, I'll put an Amazon link down below. And anytime you're using any electric kettles and anything to boil water, you want purified water. So I have a 5-stage reverse osmosis system, and I just keep a couple of gallons of water on hand every day, and I use those. So I'm going to put that on, and it takes about 5 minutes or so for that water to boil. And so maybe a little bit less than that. That's actually a pretty good, efficient kettle there. So we let that go, and then what we're going to do with the proofer is I'm going to put the mugs down there. I can't tell if I did that in here or not. So to prepare the bread pan, I'm going to use coconut oil, and I prefer extra virgin cold pressed coconut oil is the best coconut oil. Do not get a coconut oil that is liquid at room temperature. That means that it has really been adulterated. You want it to be solid room temperature, although if it's warm in the summer, it will potentially get liquid. So I'm just going to use a paper towel, scoop just a little bit of coconut oil onto the paper towel, and I'm going to use this to essentially grease the pan. We used to do this with Crisco, but of course that's a hydrogenated vegetable oil, and you do not want to use something like Crisco. That is actually quite dangerous stuff. And so I'm greasing the whole pan, and I'm making sure also to make sure you grease the upper lip. Now, this is a glass pan. I also have a steel pan, like a nonstick pan. The nonstick pan's actually a little bit better. I can see how well the bread is cooking in the glass pan, but the other one actually it's a little bit easier to get the bread out. So here, what I've already done the whole inside and the outer edges with coconut oil. So now what I'm going to do is get some flour, and I'm going to use a little wire sheath, and then we're just going to put a little bit of flour in our sheath. And then we are going to just sprinkle the flour on that. Now, usually I'm going to do this over the sink just so I don't make a big mess everywhere. But for the purpose of this video here, I'm just going to go ahead and do it right over this. So you can see what you're doing is you're just tapping the edge of the device there, and that's just going to sprinkle just a little bit in. We don't want huge amounts of flour, because if you do this huge amounts of flour, you're going to have clumps of flour on the bread. We don't want that. But we do want a nice smooth surface that's going to allow you to much easier to take the bread out of the pan. We still will probably have to run a knife along the edge, but this is going to help us quite tremendously. Note that I am also getting the tips, the very top there, which is creating a little bit of a mess, which is why I usually am going to do this over the sink. I just did it on the camera view here in this case. So by now, the bread pan's just going to sit there for a few moments, and by now the water should be just about boiled. So I think at this point, we're going to prepare the proofer. Like I said, I just use regular coffee mugs. Most people have an abundance of coffee mugs, probably too many. So I just use about 4 or 5 coffee mugs in the bottom. I might use 5 or 6. I think that's all the coffee mugs I have is maybe 5 or 6. But I'm just going to put the coffee mugs down in the bottom. I'm going to put them with the opening up. I don't want to put them with the opening down because they might float around in the water a little bit. And as I pour the boiling water in there, I want to put some of the water in the mugs and some of the water around the mugs so that we do not get the situation of the mugs floating around. Okay, so my electric kettle water is now boiling. And so what we're going to do here is I'm just going to take my electric kettle water. Be very careful, of course, you don't want to hurt yourself. But what we're going to do is I'm going to pour this into the bottom of the cooler. So you won't be able to see it on camera, but I'm just going to pour it in. I'm going to get this as low to the bottom. I'm actually going to get the cups about half full, just so that they don't move around as much. But then the rest of it's just going to be there on the bottom. And then we're going to quickly put the lid on that. Always, of course, store your electric kettle with the lid open. That way you don't get water condensation in there. It won't mess things up. All right. So now that our bread has been resting over here in our pan, is this little ball here. What we're going to do is I'm going to just kind of grab this guy, roll it into a little log, just about like this. And we're just going to plop it right in the bottom of the pan. And then we're going to plop this into the cooler. And we're going to leave it sit, probably leave it sit proofing for about about 30-35 minutes. So let me show you what that looks like. Pull my camera out over here. So you can see here what this now looks like. I have my 4 mugs down there just to make sure that the pan is not sitting directly inside the water. And then I have the water on there, and you can feel the moisture coming off. Now I'm going to close this. Now to keep it out of my way, I'm just going to just slide it as gently over as I can just to make sure that we're not going to dip over the pan or anything like that. Then I'm going to come back and check on that in about 35-45 minutes. It might take an hour in there. It might take a little bit more, a little bit less. And we're back with the bread. So what we did here is I let it sit in the proofer for just about 40-45 minutes. And let me show you what we got here. We have some wonderfully proofed bread, so we're going to be very careful with that. Then I'm going to turn on the oven. I could have turned on the oven a little bit earlier. Bread cooks somewhere between 325 and 375, whichever works well for you. Just got to move some wires out of the way here so they don't get caught in the oven. So I'm going to do 350 today. And we're just going to pop this guy right in the oven, being very gentle with it right now because as it's proofing bread, we don't want, if we're rough with it, then it could very well collapse, and we don't want that to happen. So there we have it. There is that part, and then we're going to let that cook inside the oven for probably about, we're going to check on it in about 35-40 minutes. It'll be a nice golden brown all around, and that's why I like to see the glass pan, because I'll be able to see the edges as well. And we are back. So the bread has been in the oven for 45 minutes. And at 350, 45 minutes, I'm going to show you what this looks like. I'm going to open this up. And here we have some fabulous bread. Let me go ahead and change the camera angle so you can see it a little bit better. So here is what we have. So to get this guy out, what we're going to do is, first I'm just going to see it. Sometimes it should be just good enough that we should just be able to shake it. And I'm just kind of getting a feel for, do I need to scrape the edges or not? It feels like I'm probably going to need to scrape the edges. So if that's the case, then you want to start with either a butter knife or a small paring knife. I'll start with a small paring knife. And we're just going to go right along the very edge. Now, if we did not flour the pan up, it'd be a whole lot harder to get out. But, you know, even with flouring up the pan, it's not going to pop right out necessarily. I do have some non-stick bread pans as well. I generally still prefer to use the glass ones. Okay. Looks like I missed this edge over here. I didn't edge. Let me grab this guy out real quick. Okay. So this edge of the pan, I missed a little bit there. But other than that, we have a loaf of bread that's nice and stable otherwise. This here, I dug into the edge there with a knife. But you can see for the most part, it came out. I should have just edged right around the very tip, just to double check that first. But there we have some very nice bread. I'm just going to let this cool down for a little bit, and then I'm going to serve this and enjoy this a little bit later. So thanks for watching, and come on back for more home cooking hacks.